Thank you. Well, again, thank you for having me today. The presentations have just been excellent so far, and I'm honored to be included in this summit. I am the Climate Resiliency Officer for the Seminole Tribe of Florida. And while I do represent the program, I'm not a tribal member, and I'm not an elected official for the tribe. And so these comments are my own and do not reflect the tribe as a whole. Just want to make that caveat. It's always better to get a tribal member or a representative if you can, but I'm happy to serve. Next slide, please. So I'm not aware of how much the audience has interacted with the Seminole Tribe of Florida before or not. The more that I learn about the tribe, the more that I see the Seminole Tribe and the Miccosukee as well as synonymous with Florida. I mean, I can't think of one without the other. They are, a very strong force economically, culturally. The knowledge that they have of Florida is just incredible. They have been here since time immemorial. They have evidence 12,000, 17,000 years in the past of being on this land. If anyone knows the path forward, it's going to be tribal members. They're going to understand how to survive these climatic changes better than anybody else. And so listening and engaging with these communities, is something that I fully advocate for. They have just such a rich history, and I'm sorry I won't be able to do justice in providing that to you today, but I ask you to look into it a little bit if you're of interest to you. Next slide, please. So the Seminole Tribe of Florida has 7 reservations across South and Central Florida. These are not really shown in size order. Some are very large and some are very small, but they're all across Florida. And what's most important is to understand that this is only part of their ancestral range, right? Like if you would think about dealing with climatic changes in the past, you would need to move quite a bit to handle life's uncertainties. And that is not really possible anymore. So looking at this and thinking about boundaries a little bit differently than we do today, I ask you to do the same in your work and invite the tribe to every table that you're at, every conversation that you're at, and to help the communication go back and forth and to think a little bit without boundaries so much. Next slide, please. So when I first started working for the tribe, I asked tribal members and staff, what does resilience mean to you? Because if we're going to have a climate resilient program or build climate resiliency for the community, for the assets, for the land, we needed to be clear on that definition. And I am not a huge proponent of the classic definition. And I think it all comes back to linguistics, right? Like what we say has meaning as long as we understand what the meaning is. And the engineering focused definition of bouncing back from, triggers and stressors, to some equilibrium. Well, I mean, has the status quo really gotten us where we need to be? Is that really what we want to get back to? I think we're all dreaming of something much bolder, much bigger, and very different from where we've come, in the last 50, 100, 200 years. So we really need to think about this definition of resilience and define it with our communities. For tribal members, words that came up were holistic, independence, protection, sovereignty, youth, future, vulnerability, land, kinship. So very different than what might have happened if a group of 10 planners got in a room and defined it, right? Next slide, please. I'm a planner, so I'm allowed to say that. So the Climate Resiliency Program overarching goal is to utilize both traditional ecological knowledge, which is called TEK, and Western-based science. And so to do that, I practice a lot of not just talking, but deep listening. Next slide, please. Now this presentation, you asked me to talk about what are the impacts to the tribe. Well, the climate impacts to the tribe are the same as what everyone is facing here in Florida, right? We have the exact same issues and concerns. Sea level rise, groundwater rise, changing rainfall patterns, severe weather and flooding, tidal flooding, saltwater intrusion, ocean acidification, temperature extremes, more severe and frequent drought, beach and wetland erosions, habitat zone shifts, vector-borne diseases like we were just talking about, increased food scarcity, and development pressures. Next slide, please. So to help protect the tribe and plan for climate change, I have to wear a lot of hats, right? I don't have a full staff doing all of this. So we are working, in partnership across departments to do climate education, to represent tribal interests among various state and federal agencies, to engage with the community, like I said, deeply, and look at our communication strategies, to bring in that kind of research and technical support that's so needed across efforts, and to participate in peer learning. Next slide, please. And so as I do that, especially working with tribal members and across agencies, I try to bring the ethic that the tribe has and their ethic for governance to all that I do, and to communicate that as best as I can. For the tribe, I work in the Heritage and Environmental Resources Office, which combines culture and environment, because for the tribe, they are not different. They believe that their culture, religious and recreational activities, and commercial endeavors depend on a healthy South Florida ecosystem, and their identity is one and the same with the land. So that's really important to understand how closely they hold the land to their heart. Next slide, please. So when I'm looking for experts to talk about climate change, I look to tribal members. I'm working hard to raise tribal members' voices on climate change and encourage climate conversations. One way that we do this, I have one staff person, Cody Motlow, who interviews other tribal members and publishes that in the Seminole Tribune. So that's a great way to have people feel like their voice and their perspectives and their experiences are being heard. We're also about to kick off some campfire circle sessions focused on climate change. I'm really excited about that. Thank goodness it's finally safe to gather again. And we'll be hosting our first sustainability book club next summer. We also do other kinds of climate communications as well, but those are the top three. Next slide, please. And we also try to make the work that we do with impacts really accessible and tangible. Like we were just talking about, extreme heat is the major killer of climate change. And for a long time, it hasn't been talked about. We've been talking about sea level rise mostly, right? So what I want to point out that's really, really important, I think, is that it's not an urban issue. I mean, it is an urban issue, but it's not just an urban issue. And so I'd like us to move away from thinking about extreme heat as an urban heat island issue alone. That goes back to really just looking at like where our population centers are, where the cities are, and looking at those very specific boundaries when, we pushed tribes to the marginal lands. So looking at the inland communities is really important when you think about tribes, when you think about farm workers. If you look at the Union of Concerned Scientists data on this, the inland communities in Florida are actually impacted more than the coastal ones or population centers. Yet that isn't being told in the narrative from all of the experts and well-meaning folks that are working on this issue in Florida. So I really want to point that out. I implore you to look at the data a little bit more closely and see where the biggest impacts are. This is a really big problem for the tribal community. As the last speaker was saying, increased temperatures plus humidity really increases lots of different health issues: cardiovascular disease, respiratory illness, stroke, tons of different health issues. And Indigenous populations are already at higher risk. Next slide, please. And they're at higher risk because their food systems have been so significantly altered. To say this bluntly, white people have been eating pretty crappy for a lot longer. But the transition to highly processed foods has happened much more quickly and more recently to Indigenous communities because their children were taken away from them and forced into these, schools with highly processed foods. So this happened, ripping their families apart and ripping apart their culture and ripping apart their diet all happened together very quickly. And they're still dealing with the health and psychological implications of that. And so getting back to food sovereignty, it's culture, it's safety, it's independence, it's health. it's community, it's everything. And so this has become like one of our major climate adaptation strategies is food sovereignty. And people love it. People love to get together, talk about food, eat food, grow food. It makes us all a lot happier. And so I'm very happy to work on this issue. The tribe has some knowledge. Obviously, they've had a long history of having gardens throughout Florida as a survival technique. And so we're just trying to tap into that and bring that back a little bit. Next slide, please. Of course, we've got lots else going on as well that I don't have time to get into here. We've got 2 vulnerability assessments going on, one hydrologically based, the other one culturally based. We've got 4 stormwater master planning projects going on. We've got solar going up at critical facilities at different reservations. We're making sure that new buildings are EV and solar ready. So, we're trying to expand EV and solar wherever we can. And yeah, there's just a lot going on. So next slide. And like I was saying before, there's more and more evidence that Indigenous populations across the country and all over the world have been pushed to more harsher lands, right? And they're more exposed to climate threats now. This is kind of like an obvious statement, but I think until we all read it in the New York Times a couple months ago, like I think that kind of sank in. Like we know this to be true, right? But it takes an article in the New York Times sometimes to just kind of put it in your face. And I implore you to think about that a little bit. When you're doing research and you're drawing boundaries on where the study will go, think about who lives where and why. Yes, there might be a higher density in the urban center, but we've pushed tribal communities to these relegated lands on purpose hundreds of years ago. And those effects are still being seen today by who gets data and where. That gorgeous data that we saw from the district earlier. There were major data gaps in South Central Florida. How do we know that the risk level is higher or lower in that area if we don't even know what the risk level is? These data gaps need to be filled as part of equity in our state, as part of holding our arms around the whole state and moving forward together. Next slide, please. So I end with an invitation because I am always a hopeful person. And I ask for everyone to go beyond the land acknowledgement. Think what your organization or agency can do to make tangible change. The tribe recently joined the Southwest Florida Climate Resiliency Compact. Give the tribe an equal seat as any other city, county, state, or federal agency would have. They serve as all 4 of those things at the same time. Their governments have to do, peer consultation with their neighbors on all 4 of those levels. So think about that. Move from consultation to consent. It's all in the language, right? But federal government has to consult with tribal entities. They do not, the state does not. And more responsibility is being shifted to the state. So what does that mean for tribes? And think about this, the difference in that language as you would think about protecting your 14-year-old daughter, right? There's a big difference between consultation and consent. Create opportunities for shared management. Let the tribe be an equal partner in ecological restoration and land protection. They have a long history on this land and they would really, I think, welcome that. And above all else, see ecological resources as relationships. They're not things, they're not separate from us. They're not really resources, they're relationships. And I hope we can all work to build those. Thank you. Last slide. Just as my contact information if anybody would like to reach out to me. Sure. We have stormwater master planning happening on 4 of our reservations right now. So that would look like any other city, right? We've hired consultants. We're working with our environmental resource management team. Yes, I know the name still says resources. I'm working on that. As well as our, public works department. So we are working on that now to ensure that any new housing projects, critical facilities, anything like that is built to standards. Obviously, the tribe is growing and the neighbors around the tribe are growing too. So as development increases, it's really important to know, and with climate change, it's important to know that the stormwater plans per site are in a more of a regional context, right? So yeah, to request tribal involvement, is it best to contact you directly? You could always start with me and then I can try to direct you to the right department for that kind of approval if you like. That's fine. It depends on what it's for. Do we sit on any state boards? I am not sure, but I will look and see. Thank you. How do we really change the language surrounding relationship versus resources? So you just go ahead and change the title, right, of your organization or the department. Understanding, educate more people about it. Not everyone will be reading amazing books like Writing Sweetcasts. Well, I mean, even if you don't want to read the whole book, she has lots of amazing 1 hour podcasts and things like that that are much more accessible that you can always share on social media that really get to the heart of it. There was one recently on corn, and I swear that author explained everything that you needed to know about life itself and our relationships and that whole traditional ecological knowledge in a 1 hour podcast about corn. It was absolutely incredible. So that's maybe more accessible and it's a good starting place. And are we working with other state coalitions? Yes. So when I talked about peer exchanges, I'm kind of sitting on the edge of both worlds. There's a lot of you know me already from like the climate change circles and peer exchanges, but there is an equally strong Indigenous peer exchange. There are multiple networks, including on climate. So, I'm working to serve on both of those and to try to bridge them when I can. The tribe is the first to be an accepted member of the Southeast Florida Sustainability Directors Network. We don't yet have that seat on the US SDN, but again, trying to break glass ceilings and introduce folks to each other whenever possible, because a lot of people may not understand the experts that exist on the Indigenous peer exchange side that could be brought over for those seats and boards and things like that, on the other, classic sustainability and climate side.